My name's Kate. I'm 26, and my life has always been pretty peaceful and predictable. I was used to the steady pace of life in our Los Angeles home, where it was just me, my mom, and her husband, Michael. Everything shifted the day Michael's son, Jake, moved in with us to start university and begin a new chapter in our city. Before that, we barely interacted at family get-togethers, and I didn't really know him. But now we were living under the same roof, and I had to adjust to his presence in my life. Jake was the complete opposite of what I was accustomed to. He entered our home like a burst of sunlight, full of positivity and energy that completely changed the vibe. Mom was thrilled that Jake had settled in so easily with our little family, and Michael couldn't hide his pride for his son. Jake was always laughing, cracking jokes, and finding ways to make even the most mundane things fun. He had a way of winning people over instantly. Before long, I realized I was starting to be charmed by him. One evening, Jake and I were left alone at home while Mom and Michael went out for dinner with friends. I was cooking, trying to focus on my task and not pay attention to him sitting at the kitchen table, chatting about his new hobbies and his first days at university. He was telling me about his classmates and how challenging it was to adjust to the new routine, but his voice was never filled with complaints. Instead, he made everything sound light and amusing. "Have you ever been to the beach at night?" he asked out of nowhere, interrupting his stream of stories. The question caught me off guard. I blinked, confused, trying to figure out what he meant.
No.
"Why?" I replied, assuming it was just another joke. But Jake wasn't joking. I saw something in his eyes, genuine curiosity, that made me feel a bit uneasy. "Let's go right now. It's amazing to listen to the waves when there's no one around," he suggested with a smile, and that smile seemed to answer all my unspoken questions. I wasn't ready for such an unexpected idea, but there was something about his tone and mood that made me say yes. An hour later, we were sitting on the beach, wrapped in warm blankets Jake had brought along. It was chilly, but the hot coffee we grabbed on the way helped warm us up a bit. I gazed at the stars, listening to the waves crashing against the shore. As Jake started talking about his childhood dreams and his plans for the future, I realized I hadn't felt this peaceful in a long time. "You know, Kate, sometimes it feels like I'm here by accident," he said, still staring up at the dark sky. "Like I'm doing everything right, but still feel out of place." I had never heard Jake speak like this before. He'd always seemed so confident, but his words now felt unexpectedly open and vulnerable. I turned to look at him, but he was already looking back at me. There was something in his gaze, deeper than mere interest in the conversation. It was almost as if he wanted to say something more, but hesitated. Neither of us needed to speak to understand that something significant had shifted between us in that moment. We sat there in silence, listening to the ocean, each of us pondering what would come next. That night, I returned home with the unmistakable feeling that my life would never be the same. The following weeks felt like a challenge. I couldn't stop thinking about that night on the beach, about the way Jake had looked at me as if he saw something more than just a person. We continued our conversations, and on the surface, things seemed the same. But I couldn't ignore the tension that was now there, hidden beneath our casual jokes and smiles. One evening, after a long, exhausting day at work, I walked into the kitchen to find Jake waiting for me. He'd prepared an entire meal, baked salmon, grilled vegetables, and even my favorite dessert, blueberry cheesecake. I was speechless. Eating in silence, knowing Mom and Michael would be out for hours, felt odd and a little unsettling. "You deserve to relax tonight," he said, noticing my surprised expression. "You're the queen." I laughed, but inside, I felt a tightness in my chest. His sincerity was so raw, it was almost overwhelming. We ate, made small talk, and with each glance, each accidental touch, I felt something shifting. At one point, Jake came over with 2 glasses of wine. His smile was soft, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Kate, I need to ask you something," he began, and I instantly tensed, not sure what was coming. We were standing so close now, it felt like the whole world had shrunk down to just the space between us. "Have you ever felt like you're doing something wrong, but you can't stop?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I looked at him, unsure how to respond. Everything inside me screamed that what was happening between us wasn't right, that it was crossing a line. But I couldn't voice it. At that moment, he stepped closer, and I felt his presence, his breath against my skin. His hand gently rested on my shoulder, and I didn't pull away. "Jake," I began, trying to find the right words. But before I could say anything, he leaned in, and our lips met. The kiss was soft, tentative, as if it was a moment meant to linger in memory, but not become something more. His kiss was warm, unsure, as though he was waiting for me to react, fearing he'd ruin everything. Seconds stretched into eternity, and I realized I couldn't pretend it didn't matter. When our lips parted, Jake took a step back, looking confused. We stood there, silent, looking at each other as if we were seeing one another for the first time, without the layers of familiarity.
"I'm sorry."
"I didn't mean to," he started, but I stopped him, gently placing my hand on his lips. I didn't need his apologies. What I needed was time to process what had just happened. The rest of the evening passed in silence. The tension between us felt palpable, as though we had crossed an invisible line, and now we had to decide what to do next. I went to my room, locked the door, and felt my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't sleep for hours. My mind kept replaying that kiss, and it felt like more than just affection. It was something deeper, riskier. I didn't know if I could live with this, pretending it was nothing, or if we needed to face it head-on. The next morning, Jake was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened. We exchanged awkward smiles, and I realized that this discomfort was now part of our reality, something we had to navigate. What scared me most was not knowing where it would lead us. After that night, everything felt different. I tried to distance myself from Jake, avoiding his gaze and the accidental brushes of our hands. But you can't escape your own feelings. Every time we crossed paths in the house, my heart betrayed me. It was like a silent understanding had settled between us, unspoken but clear. We didn't talk about it, didn't try to make sense of it. And that unaddressed tension sank me down, heavy like a stone. A few days after the kiss, Jake suggested we take a trip out of town for a change of scenery and some fresh air. I hesitated, but his usual smile, so genuine and convincing, was enough to make me agree. We packed a small picnic, loaded the bikes into the car, and headed for a park on the outskirts of the city. The park was quiet and nearly empty. I pedaled along the winding paths, feeling the wind on my face, trying to push aside thoughts of Jake, who was riding just behind me. He joked and laughed, trying to pull me into conversation, but I stayed quiet, determined to stay distant. As I focused ahead, it felt like the world had shrunk to the narrow roads and beams of sunlight breaking through the trees. When we reached a meadow by a lake, Jake suggested we stop. I agreed, wiping the sweat off my forehead before sitting on the grass. We laid out blankets, and Jake unpacked lemonade and sandwiches. We ate in silence, watching the water shimmer as the sun began to set. "Do you remember that night on the beach?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence. I froze, not expecting him to bring it up. His words felt so casual, as if he were talking about something trivial. But for me, it hit like a punch to the stomach.
"Yeah."
"Of course," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, hiding the quiver in it. Jake set his sandwich down and looked at me with a serious expression, one that made my heart race in a way I wasn't ready for. "I can't stop thinking about it, Kate," he said, and his honesty was so raw that I didn't know how to respond. A cold shiver ran down my spine. For days, I had been trying to bury my feelings, and now he was pulling them to the surface, forcing me to face them. "Jake, this is wrong," I started, but he shook his head as if he didn't want to hear any excuses. He moved closer, and I felt my pulse quicken. What if being right is just being yourself? Being honest, even when everything feels messed up, he asked, his voice soft. He leaned in, and I felt the warmth of his breath against my skin. I wanted to pull away, but somehow I stayed where I was, unable to move. Our faces were so close now, I could see every detail of his features, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. And then, without another word, he kissed me. This kiss was different. It wasn't hesitant like the first one. It was full of tenderness and desire, but not the kind that scared you. It was something deeper, something that made me feel like we finally understood each other in a way words couldn't capture. I kissed him back, letting all my doubts slip away. In that moment, everything else disappeared. It was just the two of us, sitting on the blanket by the lake, losing ourselves in each other. When we pulled apart, there was a spark between us, one that couldn't be ignored. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. We both knew we had crossed a line, one we couldn't come back from. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew, in that moment, that our story wasn't over. Jake smiled at me and took my hand. We sat in silence, watching the sunset, and the long road home ahead felt different this time, less daunting, somehow. We traveled back in a silence that no longer felt heavy. It was a silence where we had found each other. As time went on, it became increasingly obvious to me that our feelings were growing stronger. I could sense our parents beginning to notice. Mom would give me these questioning looks whenever Jake and I would linger in the kitchen, laughing over something small. But we tried to act normal, keeping the growing tension hidden behind closed doors. One evening, Michael came home earlier than usual and found us cooking together. We were standing close, and there was something in the air, something unspoken, but impossible to miss. Michael sat down at the table, his head resting in his hands, watching us in silence. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to sound casual, but I could feel my heart racing. Jake tried to maintain his composure, but I could see his shoulders tense. It was like the air around us was screaming the truth, and it was only a matter of time before it all came out. "You too," Michael began, his voice calm, but with a hint of something else underneath. "You're acting differently. I'm not blind. I can tell something's going on between you." My heart skipped a beat. I had no idea how to respond. Jake gave me a quick, panicked look, and I realized he was just as lost as I was. All the things we'd been hiding so carefully were on the verge of coming to light, and I had no idea how to stop it. "Michael, we've just gotten closer lately," I said, my voice unconvincing. It felt like I wasn't just trying to convince him, but myself. "Not so much, Michael," Jake said, his voice heavy with doubt. He opened his mouth, as if he was about to say something, but then stopped, realizing that any word now would only make things worse. The rest of the evening was painfully tense. We ate dinner in near silence. Mom seemed to feel it too, but didn't say anything. When it was time to clear the table, Michael stood up abruptly, collecting the dishes before heading into the kitchen. His steps echoed in the quiet, as though he was trying to deal with whatever emotions had been stirred up. I followed him, leaving Jake and Mom alone in the living room. Michael was leaning against the sink, staring out the window. I approached, trying to find the right words to ease the tension, but nothing came to mind. "Michael, you have to understand." I began to speak, but Michael interrupted me without turning around. "Kate, you know I love both of you, but what I'm seeing, it's crossing the line." His voice was tired, edged with disappointment. I could tell how difficult this was for him, and it hurt me to see how our actions were affecting the people we cared about. I fell silent, knowing that any attempt to explain would be pointless. Jake and I had already crossed a line, one with no return. This was our decision, and we would have to live with it. The truth was, honesty mattered now more than ever, even if the truth was painful. Later that night, when the house was still and quiet, Jake knocked softly on my door. I let him in, and we stood together in the dark. We both knew that the conversation with Michael was only the beginning of what we had to face. "We can't hide anymore," Jake said, his voice steady with a determination that made the tension inside me ease just a little. He stepped closer, taking my hands in his, looking into my eyes for what felt like a long time. "I can't lose you, Kate. Even if everything falls apart, I need you to know that. I want to be honest with you," he continued. "And with them." I nodded, feeling the weight of what we were about to do. It wasn't easy, but it was the only way forward. We were both scared, but it was a fear we couldn't overcome without taking action. I leaned into him, drawing strength from his warmth, and in that moment, I knew we would get through this together. That night, we made the decision, no more hiding. Though the future was uncertain, we knew that the most important thing was to be true to ourselves and to each other. We could no longer postpone the conversation. The following evening, after dinner with Michael and Mom, Jake and I decided it was time to make everything clear. We waited for them to return from work. Sitting in the living room, my hands were cold, and my heart was pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Jake squeezed my hand tightly, as if trying to give me his confidence, but I could feel that he was nervous too. When our parents finally walked in, they immediately sensed that something was wrong. Mom stopped in the doorway, her eyes narrowing in suspicion, while Michael sighed heavily, already bracing for what was coming. "We need to talk," I said, my voice shaking. Jake tightened his grip on my hand, and his support helped me keep going, even as the weight of the moment threatened to overwhelm me. We sat down on the couch, and our parents took their seats across from us, waiting, the tension between us thick and palpable. "We know our feelings might seem wrong to you," Jake began, his words hanging in the air, like a confession that had been waiting to be said for too long. "But we can't keep hiding it. We need to tell you the truth." Mom leaned forward, her eyes filled with confusion and anxiety. I couldn't look at her. I dropped my gaze, feeling small, like I wasn't strong enough for this. "What do you mean?" Michael asked, though the answer was already clear. His voice cracked like thunder, a storm of emotions just waiting to break. "We love each other," I said softly, the words finally tumbling out. It was like a release, but at the same time, the fear of what would come next settled over me. The shock and disbelief were clear on both Mom's and Michael's faces. They were struggling to comprehend how things had gotten this far. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, as if she were afraid of saying something she couldn't take back. Michael stood up, unable to stay still, and began pacing the room. He was trying to calm himself, but his anger and confusion were palpable. For the first time, I realized how hard this conversation was not just for us, but for them as well. "Do you realize how wrong this is?" Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "What will people think? What are you doing?" "We trusted you both," he continued, his words cutting deep. "We thought you would be family. We thought you could act like a family." Jake stood up, his voice firm but filled with emotion. "We tried. We really tried to ignore what we felt. But we couldn't. This isn't a phase. It's not some passing infatuation. We love each other, and we couldn't keep pretending otherwise." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air, thick with disbelief and unspoken fears. Mom finally spoke, her voice quiet and sad. "I just don't understand how this happened. How did we miss it? How did we not see it?" I didn't know how to answer. This whole situation felt unreal, like a dream I was finally waking up from. And as I looked at my family, I knew that from this point forward, nothing would ever be the same. We would have to live with the consequences of our choices. And that terrified me more than anything. The weeks that followed were filled with tense conversations, long silences, and the struggle to make sense of everything. We tried to explain ourselves, to make our parents understand that our feelings weren't just some fleeting thing. Slowly, they began to realize that this wasn't a phase, and it wasn't going away. It wasn't easy, but day by day, we took small steps toward healing. Mom and Michael started to see that Jake and I truly cared for each other. They started to understand that love doesn't always follow the rules or make sense in the way people expect it to. We hadn't figured everything out yet, but we knew we needed to take things slowly. We didn't have all the answers, but we were willing to figure it out together. Jake and I decided not to rush into any big decisions. We didn't have a roadmap for what came next, but we were learning to build a new kind of understanding. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, but with each step we took, we knew we were in this together. Looking at Jake, I realized that no matter what the world thought, we had something real. And together, we could face whatever came next. And though we knew there would be more difficult conversations and trials ahead, we also knew that the most important thing was our honesty. We had chosen love, even if it went against expectations, even if it didn't fit into anyone's idea of what was normal. We had chosen a path that felt true to us, and that, we knew, was only the beginning.